The snow came down in silence that morning, heavy as grief. Across the white expanse, a figure moved slowly. A woman, thin as hunger, carrying more sorrow than belongings.
Just hold on.
In one hand,
We need
a
to stop
battered
the
trunk.
bleeding.
In the other,
trying.
a rifle too heavy for her frame. Her name was Clara Bellamy. She had buried her husband in the river back in Missouri, and with him, all reason to remain among neighbors who whispered she was cursed. Now, she had come west, where the land was wide, and hearts, they said, were harder. At the edge of the wilderness, a cabin waited. Smoke curled weakly from its chimney, and on the porch, a scarred cowboy watched her approach, his silence colder than the snow itself. The stagecoach had left her at the crossroads 2 miles back, where the prairie bent into a scatter of scrub oaks and the wind carried the first sharp bite of winter. Clara Bellamy walked the rest of the way alone, skirts catching dust, boots sodden from a shallow creek crossing. She carried one battered trunk lashed with a fraying rope, a rifle that dragged her shoulder with every step, and a shawl pulled tight against the chill. Inside the trunk, wrapped in old linen, lay the last relic of her past life, a folded wedding dress whose lace had yellowed with years of grief. The land stretched wide and empty before her, sky iron gray, earth the color of ashes. She thought, as she had many times during the long journey west, that if she closed her eyes and lay down, the wind itself might bury her. Yet her feet kept moving, carrying her to the lone homestead crouched at the base of a low ridge. The house was small, clapboard weather-beaten, with smoke drifting thin from its chimney. A barn leaned against the wind as though tired of standing. Tools lay scattered by a fence line where posts sagged inward. The place spoke of endurance, not prosperity. A dog barked once from under the porch and then fell silent as a man stepped into the doorway. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with a face carved as though from stone, a scar traced from the corner of his jaw down into the shadow of his collar, and his eyes were pale gray, colder than the sky above. Clara stopped at the gate, setting down her trunk. Her breath came ragged, though she tried to stand straight. "I'm looking for work," she said, her voice roughened by days without conversation. The man's gaze traveled over her, worn boots, thin frame, rifle too long for her grip. His silence was heavier than words. At last he said, "Don't need help." Clara lowered her eyes. She had expected as much. No one wanted a widow who trailed misfortune like dust. The townsfolk in Missouri had whispered after her husband's drowning, called her cursed, said her eyes were bad luck on a river. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps she had brought the river's cold hands upon him. "I can cook," she said, quietly. "Mend. Keep the stove burning." The man's jaw worked. Behind him, clouds thickened, and the wind carried the smell of coming snow. He shifted his weight as though torn between closing the door and letting her fall to the weather, or letting her inside and troubling the peace he had carved from solitude. Finally, he stepped aside. "Storm's coming," he muttered. "Can't send you off tonight." Clara lifted her trunk again, shoulders trembling with the strain, and carried it to the porch. The man did not move to help. His eyes followed her, measuring, weighing. She passed him and entered the house, feeling the cold follow at her heels. Inside, the room was plain and serviceable. A wood stove glowed faintly in the corner. A rocking chair faced the fire, its seat worn smooth. The table bore the marks of a knife blade and the stains of countless suppers. There was no softness, no lace curtain, no touch of a woman's hand. Only necessity. He closed the door behind her and set his rifle against the wall. "Elias Boone," he said, voice low as gravel. "Clara Bellamy." He gave no nod of acknowledgement, only crossed to the stove and stirred the embers with a poker. Sparks leapt, then settled back into coals. She placed her trunk near the wall and stood uncertainly, shawl tight around her shoulders. Her eyes traced the scar on his face, the hard set of his mouth. This was no welcoming hearth. Yet here, at least, was shelter. Supper was bread coarse as bark and beans boiled with salt pork. They ate in silence, the fire crackling between them. Elias sat sharpening a hunting knife, long strokes of the whetstone filling the air. The rasp of steel on stone seemed to measure time itself. Clara forced the food down, though her throat ached with loneliness. She glanced at him once, across the lamplight. The shadows deepened the lines of his face. His eyes stayed on the blade, never on her. The firelight showed the calluses on his hands, the small scar at his knuckles, the work of a man long accustomed to survival without company. Clara's fingers tightened around her spoon. She had traveled west, hoping that distance might silence her grief, that new horizons might wash away the river's image of her husband sinking beneath black water. But here, in the silence of this stranger's house, she felt the same hollow ache. Loneliness had followed her like a faithful hound. When the meal was done, Elias set the knife aside and rose. "There's a cot by the wall. You'll take that." Nodded. "Thank you." He gave no reply, only stepped out to the porch where the boards creaked under his boots. Clara sat alone at the table, listening to the wind gather in the eaves. She reached for her shawl, pulling it close as if it might guard her against more than the cold. Later, when the fire burned low, she lay upon the narrow cot. Her trunk rested against the wall beside her, its contents whispering of the life she had lost. She thought of the wedding dress folded within, its lace once bright but now faded to the color of old snow. She had meant to wear it only once, yet she had carried it across half a continent. Why? Perhaps because it was proof she had once been chosen, once been loved. Her eyes closed, but sleep did not come easily. The wind howled through the chinks in the walls, rattling the shutters. Somewhere outside, Elias's boots thudded across the porch as he checked the night. He was a man of stone and silence, she thought, yet he had not cast her into the storm. Clara turned toward the fire's last glow, her body aching from the road, her heart heavier than her trunk. She had run from pity, from whispers, from the river itself. Yet she had found only another silence, another wall of loneliness. Still, as the storm rose over the plains, she told herself, "At least I am not out there." And for now, that was enough. The storm passed in the night, leaving the plains brittle and raw under a pale dawn. Clara rose early, her breath fogging the air as she coaxed the stove back to life. Elias had already gone to the barn, his heavy boots leaving prints across the frost. She watched from the doorway as he moved with a slow, deliberate strength, shoulders bowed beneath the weight of years that hung on him like an old yoke. She turned back to the stove, hands trembling slightly as she sliced what bread remained. The knife's edge caught the lamplight, reminding her of his scar, of the hardness in his eyes. Yet the bread was for him, and she warmed the beans too, because that was what one did. She had kept house once before, for another man who had left, her with silence of a different sort. The days settled into a pattern, strained but steady. Clara mended shirts by the fire, her needle slipping through cloth while Elias labored outside. When he returned, she left the mending in her lap and poured coffee, though he never asked. At night, she sat rocking in the chair near the stove, the boards creaking softly beneath her. He sat sharpening tools or oiling his rifle, the silence between them unbroken but not empty. Clara noticed things. His tools were old, their handles worn smooth, as if no new thing had entered this house in years. The barn roof sagged inward where snow might soon fall, and the fences bowed under neglect. His life was weather-beaten, threadbare, stitched together, with the same quiet persistence she used on torn seams. Elias noticed things too, though he never spoke them. He saw how her braid loosened when she worked, dark strands falling against her cheek until she brushed them back. He saw how she folded her shawl with care each night before laying it across the cot, as though the worn fabric was some heirloom of dignity she refused to surrender. On the fourth evening, while the wind rattled dry weeds against the porch, she spoke for the first time of her husband. "He drowned," she said simply, fingers knotted in her lap. "The river took him." Elias did not look up from his knife. The steady rasp of stone on steel filled the pause. "Boating accident?" "Capsized." Her voice was flat, but her chest tightened with the words. "We had been married 3 years. The neighbors said he was unlucky to have me. Said my eyes brought him bad water." His hand slowed. He set the knife down and studied the blade's edge as though it carried answers. People talk too much. They always do. Clara's eyes lowered to the fire. The gossip had burned hotter than grief, whispers that she had cursed him, that her presence had called the river's hand. She had walked streets of pity and suspicion until she could no longer bear it. That was why she had come west, carrying her shame like another trunk. Elias did not answer. Yet his silence held no contempt, only a weight of understanding. The next day, as Clara scrubbed a pot at the well, she found him watching her. The scar on his jaw caught the weak sun, a pale reminder of some violence past. She felt the question in his eyes before he spoke. "You're not the only one folks talk about." His voice was rough but not unkind. She waited. "My brother." He looked away, toward the ridge. "We were driving cattle south when a band of Comanche came through. They took him. I was 19, couldn't stop it. Folks said I ran, said I left him." Clara set the pot aside, her hands red from cold water. "You didn't?" His jaw tightened. "I fought. Got this for it." He touched the scar with 2 fingers. "But I couldn't save him. So maybe it don't matter what I did." The wind whistled between them. Clara's heart ached at the hollow in his voice, the same hollow she felt in her own. Different rivers. Same loss. She drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "They were wrong to judge you." His eyes flicked too, hers then sharp and searching. For a moment she feared she had spoken too boldly, but he only gave a slight nod and turned back to his work. That night the silence between them felt altered, less like a wall, more like a wound shared. Clara sat rocking slowly, her needle flashing in the lamplight as she finished a seam. Elias sat across from her, oiling his rifle. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the chimney. At last she spoke, not looking up from her mending. "Grief hollows a person." He set the rifle aside. "It does. Sometimes I think there's nothing left of me but that hollow." The boards creaked as he shifted in his chair. She felt his eyes on her, but she did not lift her own. "You're still here," he said after a long pause. "That means something." Her needle stilled. She swallowed hard. It was not comfort, not warmth, but it was acknowledgement, and that was more than she had expected. Days bled into each other. Clara swept the floors, boiled beans, patched Elias's shirts. He repaired the barn roof with her, steadying the ladder. She found herself humming softly once as she worked, only to stop when she realized the sound of it startled her. Elias, too, seemed startled, though he said nothing. Their griefs lay between them like 2 stones in the same stream, separate but touched by the same current. Neither dared speak of healing, not yet. But in the rocking of the chair, in the steam of morning coffee, in the shared silence that no longer cut as sharply, there was the faintest suggestion of something other than emptiness. Clara still carried her husband's memory, heavy as ever. Elias still bore the scar of his brother's loss. Yet each had begun to see that the other was not fragile, not weak, but hollowed out in a shape familiar to their own. And in that recognition, though unspoken, lay the smallest seed of survival. By dusk the clouds had gathered again, black as coal smoke, rolling across the plains with the growl of distant thunder. Elias set extra wood by the stove, his movements sharp, purposeful, as if bracing himself against the sky itself. Clara closed, the shutters, hands trembling slightly as the wind pressed against them with hollow moans. The first drops of rain struck the roof like thrown stones. Soon the storm was upon them, rattling the house, driving water through every crack in the walls. The dog barked once, then whimpered and crawled beneath the porch. Inside, the fire cast restless shadows. Clara sat near the stove, sewing basket at her feet, while Elias paced like a man who could not be still. He muttered about the barn roof, about the cattle penned too close to the creek. But his eyes kept darting to the door, as though the storm carried more than rain upon its back. Then, 3 sharp knocks. Both froze. The sound was small against the thunder, yet it cut through the house like a blade. Elias's hand went to his rifle. His jaw tightened. No one should be out on a night like this. The knock came again, weaker this time. Clara rose, her shawl drawn, close. She looked at Elias, saw the shadow harden in his eyes. He shook his head. Could be trouble. It could be a man dying, she answered softly. Lightning flared, bleaching the room white. Thunder rolled over the house. And then the door opened on the wind. A figure sagged against the frame, a young Lakota man soaked through, blood dark against his shirt. His breath came in shuddering gasps. He looked barely more than 20. Elias lifted the rifle. Get back. But Clara was already moving. She caught the stranger beneath the arm before he could collapse. His weight dragged at her, and she staggered. Help me, she said sharply. For a heartbeat, Elias stood rigid, torn between the barrel of his rifle and the plea in her voice. Then, with a curse, he slung the weapon aside and took the youth's other arm. Together they dragged him inside, closing the door against the storm. The man lay stretched on the floorboards, water pooling beneath him. His lips moved, though his words were lost beneath the thunder. Clara knelt, brushing wet hair from his brow. Her fingers found the wound, ragged, high along his ribs. Knife, she whispered. Days old, maybe. Elias hovered, fists clenched. We can't keep him here. If we leave him, he dies. Clara's voice was firm, more than she thought herself capable of. I won't let that happen. He stared at her, the storm's roar filling the silence between them. At last he turned away, striking flint to the lantern. Light flared, golden against the dark. Clara worked quickly, cutting cloth into strips. She pressed them to the wound, murmuring low words that were more prayer than instruction. The youth flinched, teeth bared, but his eyes found hers. In them she saw not menace, but fear, and beneath it, a desperate will to live. Elias stood over them, rifle now leaning by the wall. His face was carved of suspicion, yet something flickered there as Clara's hands moved with steady care. He had not seen that look in years, not since before the raid, before his brother had been taken. Compassion, unguarded. It struck him like a forgotten sound. The storm deepened. Rain hammered the roof. Wind shrieked through the seams of the barn. Inside, 3 figures sat in uneasy communion. The wounded youth, half conscious upon the cot. Clara beside him, shawl slipping from her shoulders as she tended him. Elias across the room, knife in hand though he did not use it, his eyes never leaving the stranger. Clara's hair had fallen from its braid, dark strands plastered against her damp cheek. She did not brush them away. Her whole attention lay in the rhythm of the young man's breathing, in the press of cloth against blood. For the first time in months she felt a spark of purpose stronger than grief. She had not come west to save anyone, least of all herself. Yet here she was, fighting for the life of a stranger. Elias watched her with a heaviness he could not name. This woman who had walked into his home hollow and fading, now burned with quiet fire. And he who had sworn never to trust again, felt the ember of that fire warming a place long left cold, but he would not yield to it. If his people come, Elias muttered, they'll think we took him. They'll bring the fight here. Clara lifted her gaze. The lamplight caught her eyes, tired yet steady. And if we throw him back into the storm, what kind of people are we? Her words hung in the room, more cutting than thunder. Elias had no answer. Hours passed. The youth drifted in and out of fevered sleep. Clara kept vigil, changing the cloths, humming a tune she half remembered from childhood. Outside, the storm raged, but inside her voice threaded through the air, like a fragile candle flame. Elias sat in the rocker, sharpening a tool he did not need to sharpen, just to keep his hands busy. Yet his eyes betrayed him. They kept sliding to Clara, to the curve of her bent shoulders, to the shawl slipping and the way she did not notice the cold. Each detail unsettled him, reminding him of things he had buried beneath scar and silence. At last, the storm began to ebb. Rain softened. Wind faltered. The house breathed easier. Clara pressed one last strip of cloth to the wound, then leaned back, exhausted. The young man slept more peacefully now, chest rising slow but steady. She turned toward Elias. "He'll live." He said nothing, but he looked at her a long time, gray eyes unreadable, and for the first time since she had arrived, the storm left behind a land soaked and sullen. Puddles pooled in the wagon ruts and the barn sagged under the weight of damp. Inside the house, the air smelled of wet earth, smoke, and boiled herbs. The Lakota youth remained under their roof, stretched thin upon the cot, his wound dressed in fresh cloth. His breathing had steadied, but fever still tugged at him in waves. Clara tended him each morning. She cut old shirts into strips and braided them into thicker bands before binding his ribs. The braiding calmed her, 3 strands twisted into one, fragile threads woven stronger together. Each knot reminded her of lives broken and mended, hers no less than his. Elias watched from across the room, gray eyes shadowed. The sight unsettled him. Clara's hands, steady and gentle, weaving strength where weakness should have reigned. She moved with a quiet resolve he had not thought her capable of, yet unease gnawed at him. What if the youth's kin came riding? What if others followed the trail of blood to his door? Hospitality could be mistaken for allegiance, and in these borderlands, such mistakes cost lives. Days passed in strained rhythm. Clara hummed softly while cooking broth, her voice fragile, but steady. Elias mended fence posts with restless hands, though his gaze kept drifting back to the house. At night, the 3 of them shared the hearth in silence. The youth swaddled in blankets, Clara seated nearby with her shawl close, Elias in his rocker, rifle leaning against the wall. It was around that fire that words began to emerge. The youth's English was halting, shaped by struggle, but he managed enough to tell fragments of his story. His family had been driven from their hunting grounds, their lodges burned. He had fled violence not unlike the raid that had once torn Elias's brother from his side. Elias listened, jaw tight, fists clenched on his knees. Old bitterness stirred, like a snake uncoiling. He wanted to shut his ears, to dismiss the words as lies or half-truths. Yet the youth's hollow eyes mirrored something Elias knew too well. Loss, carved deep, a wound that did not heal with time. Clara sat between them, her shawl wrapped firm around her shoulders. She listened, watching the hard lines of Elias's face soften and tighten, like a man torn between hatred and recognition. On the 5th night, the wind carried distant hooves. Elias rose at once, hand going to his rifle. He crossed to the window, staring into the dark where moonlight pooled across the prairie. Riders, he could not see them yet, but he could hear. His scar ached with memory. He turned sharply. "He can't stay." His voice was low, urgent. "They'll come looking. If they find him here." Clara stood, heart pounding. The youth stirred on the cot, feverish still, too weak to rise. She stepped in front of him, shawl drawn tight like a shield. "No," she said firmly. Elias froze, as if the word itself had struck him. "I will not see him cast out," she went on, her voice trembling but resolute. "I have been cast out. I know what it is to be turned into the cold, unwanted. I will not let it happen under this roof." The room thrummed with silence. The fire snapped in the grate, shadows jerking across Elias's scarred face. His grip tightened on the rifle. He could almost feel the riders outside, ghosts of men who had once torn his life apart. Yet his eyes locked on Clara's, fierce, unyielding, alive with something more powerful than fear. He saw in that moment not the hollow widow who had staggered to his door weeks before, but a woman standing with iron in her spine. Her conviction unsettled him more than the riders did. Slowly he lowered the rifle. His chest rose and fell as if he had fought some battle within himself. "You don't know what you're asking," he muttered. "Yes, I do." Her voice softened but did not break. "Mercy is not weakness, Elias. It's the only strength left to us." The hoofbeats faded into distance, swallowed by night. Only then did Elias set the rifle back against the wall. He dragged a hand over his face as though weary to the bone. Clara did not move from where she stood, her shawl wrapped tight, her body guarding the wounded youth. Something had shifted between them, though neither spoke of it. Elias had seen her fire, her refusal to surrender to despair. Clara had seen his fear and his choice to relent, not for the stranger's sake, but for hers. When at last she returned to her chair by the hearth, her hands trembled with the aftermath. But beneath the tremor was something else, a strange new pulse, a will to fight for life, not just endure it. She was no longer the woman who had closed her eyes hoping for death. She was alive, and she meant to prove it. Elias sat opposite her, staring into the fire. His scar caught the glow, his eyes, shadowed but softened. He realized then that his dignity could not be preserved by keeping the world at bay. Isolation had been armor, but it had left him hollow. To remain so was to let the past keep him buried beside his brother. The youth shifted in his sleep, breathing more evenly now. Clara reached to tuck the blanket closer about him, her fingers brushing the braid she had tied into his bandages, threads woven into strength. Elias saw the gesture and for the first time felt its meaning. Perhaps broken lives, too, could be braided together, given purpose beyond their scars. That night the fire burned low, but its warmth lingered. The house no longer felt like a fortress against the storm, but like a fragile haven struggling toward mercy. And though danger still prowled beyond the walls, something stronger stirred within. The first fragile ties of trust, woven as carefully as cloth strips into a wound. Winter laid its hand across the prairie with a grip that did not loosen. Each morning dawned white and still, snow pressing against the windows, muting every sound. The house became a crucible, its walls holding not only heat, but the closeness of 3 lives bound by chance. Elias rose early before the light, stoking the stove until the iron glowed red. The smell of coffee filled the room, bitter and grounding. One morning, Clara stirred from the cot and found a second cup poured, steam curling upward. She hesitated, shawl gathered close before taking it in both hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias only grunted, but he did not miss the way her fingers lingered around the warmth, nor the faint lift in her eyes. The days passed in quiet rhythm. Clara mended shirts, her needle flashing while snow piled high outside. Sometimes she hummed softly, as if testing the sound of her own voice against the hush of the storm. Elias pretended not to notice, busying himself with tools, but the melody clung to the air, fragile and persistent as the first birds of spring. At night, shadows lengthened across the firelit walls. Clara's rocking chair creaked in time with Elias's whetstone strokes, and in that rhythm, something unspoken grew. Their words were few, but their silences changed, less guarded, more laden with things neither dared yet to name. The Lakota. Youth, still weak, joined them by the fire in short intervals. He spoke sparingly, English broken but gratitude clear in his eyes. Clara treated him with the same steady kindness as before, binding his wound with fresh strips of cloth. Elias watched, conflicted but no longer resisting. The sight of her gentleness no longer angered him. It unsettled him in another way, stirring memories of a life once softer. One evening, when the wind screamed against the shutters, Clara drew her trunk from its place against the wall. She knelt beside it, fingers trembling on the rope-tied lid. Elias, sharpening a blade nearby, glanced up as she opened it. Inside lay the folded wedding dress. She lifted it with reverence, the lace yellowed, the fabric fragile as moth wings. For a long while she only stared, her face lit by firelight, her breath caught between grief and release. Elias said nothing. The crackle of fire filled the room, the scent of pine smoke wrapping around them. Clara's fingers traced the worn hem. Then slowly she tore a strip free, the sound of ripping cloth startling in the quiet. She fed the torn piece into the flames. The fire took it greedily, curling lace into smoke, reducing memory to ash. Elias's knife paused mid-stroke. His eyes lifted, gray and unreadable, fixed on her. She felt the weight of his gaze but did not look away. Her hand still held the rest of the dress, trembling, but her face was calm. Without speaking, Elias set the knife aside. He extended his hand across the space between them, rough, scarred, hesitant. Not a proposal, not a claim, but a gesture, acknowledgement, solidarity. Clara stared at his hand. Her throat tightened, her breath shallow. Then she placed her own hand in his, small and pale against his strength. For a moment, neither moved. Yet in that stillness, something passed between them. Trust, fragile but real, like an ember coaxed from cold ash. She did not smile, nor did he. But the fire between them was no longer only in the hearth. By the next week, the youth was strong, enough to stand. He moved with care, leaning on the wall, his dark eyes solemn. Elias saddled a horse for him without words, while Clara prepared food wrapped in cloth. When the moment came, the youth hesitated at the door. He reached to the garment still clinging, to his shoulder, torn and stained from the wound, and ripped a narrow strip free. Stepping to Clara, he braided the cloth with slow care, weaving it into the fringe of her shawl. The braid hung there when he finished, a token of kinship that needed no language. Clara's eyes shone with unshed tears. She touched the braid lightly, bowing her head in thanks. Elias stood nearby, arms crossed. He gave no outward sign of approval, but he did not object. He understood what the gesture meant. A bond where there had once been only mistrust. The youth rode into the snowbound horizon, his figure dwindling until the white swallowed him whole. Silence filled the house again, but it was a different silence. No longer crowded by suspicion, but weighted with something fragile and human. That night, Clara sat by the fire with her shawl around her shoulders, the new braid resting against her hand. Elias sat across from her, tools forgotten, his eyes caught by the flicker of flame. She thought of the dress in her trunk, now torn and diminished. It no longer chained her to a past she could not escape. It was only cloth, and she was something more. She had fed grief to the fire and found that life remained. Elias thought of the riders he had feared, the brother he had lost, the years he had spent walling himself from mercy. Watching Clara in the firelight, he realized that hardness was not dignity, it was only weariness. True strength lay in the gentleness he had nearly forgotten how to touch. The fire snapped, sending sparks into the chimney. Their shadows leaned closer, though their bodies did not move. The night stretched long and quiet, but it was no longer empty. Something had taken root between them, quiet and steady as snow upon the earth. And for the first time in years, both felt the warmth of belonging. The storm had passed, but winter still lay thick upon the land. Days were pale with cold light, nights black and long. Elias's homestead stood against it all, small and solitary, smoke curling thin from the chimney. Clara tended the fire, shawl drawn around her shoulders, the braid of cloth resting where her hand often lingered. It was toward dusk when the sound came, hoofbeats muffled by snow, yet steady, insistent. Elias straightened from the woodpile, axe in hand, listening with that instinct honed by years of solitude. Riders. More than one. Clara felt it too. She set down the pot she was holding, her breath caught in her throat. Elias entered, jaw set, scar tight along his face. "Stay inside," he said. But Clara did not retreat. Instead, she pulled the shawl tighter, her eyes firm. The riders came into view through the veil of snow. 4 men, their rifles slung, eyes sharp with purpose. They dismounted at the barn, boots crunching, and spread like wolves. The leader, a heavy man with a beard stiff with frost, called out, "Boone, we hear you took in an Indian boy. Where is he?" Elias stepped into the barn doorway, rifle in hand, shadow stretching long against the snow. "He's gone, nothing here for you." The man sneered. "Gone, is he? Maybe so, but I think you helped him. That makes you as good as his kind." His gaze slid toward the house where Clara stood just within the lamplight, and maybe her too. Elias's grip tightened. "Leave her out of this," The barn smelled of hay and old wood, snow sifting through broken boards, firelight from the lantern throwing restless shadows. Rifles were raised. A standoff hung, like frost in the air. Clara's shawl slipped as she moved, the braid of cloth falling into sight. One of the riders cursed softly, pointing. He marked her. They're kin to him now. Elias stepped forward, his voice steady as stone. You'll not touch her, nor will you have his trail from me. You come here looking for blood, you'll find your own. The words rang heavy, carrying not only defiance but the weight of justice and mercy both. The leader's eyes narrowed. You die for them? No, Elias said, his voice low, unyielding. I'd live for them, and I'll kill if I must. A long silence followed, breath steaming in the cold air, wood creaking under snow. Then, sudden as lightning, a rifle cracked. The barn shook with the sound. Elias's rifle spoke in the same heartbeat. The leader staggered back, eyes wide, snow darkening beneath him. The others froze, then scattered, spooked by the fire in Elias's stance vanishing into the storm. Smoke drifted from Elias's barrel. The barn fell silent save for the beat of Clara's breath. She had not prayed for death, as she once had, so many nights. She realized, trembling, that her heart had prayed only for Elias to live. He lowered the rifle slowly, his scarred face unreadable in the lantern glow. Then his eyes met hers. For the first time, he let her see the weariness and the strength both unguarded. The days that followed were quiet. Snow continued to fall, covering the tracks, covering the blood. The world moved on as it always did. When the weather broke, Elias saddled 2 horses. Town, he said simply. Clara mounted beside him, her hands uncertain on the reins, but steady in purpose. They rode together through the pale light of morning. The land stretched wide, white and endless, their breath rising in clouds. By the time they reached town, the streets were muddy slush, townsfolk pausing in their work to watch. Clara felt the stares, some curious, some wary, but none with the sharpness she once knew. No whispers of curse, no pity disguised as kindness. Beside Elias she sat tall, the braid in her shawl moving with the wind. They were seen not as broken souls, but as weathered survivors who had chosen dignity over despair. Elias traded for supplies, his presence solid, unspoken strength. Clara walked with him, shawl gathered close, her chin lifted. No one dared question them. On the ride back, silence stretched between them, but it was not empty. It was full as the winter sky, wide and brimming with things yet to come. That evening, back at the homestead, Clara settled into the rocking chair. Firelight washed her face, softening the lines grief had etched there. The shawl warmed her shoulders, the braid a reminder of kinship that reached beyond blood. Elias sat beside her, sharpening a tool, the rasp steady, familiar. He glanced toward her once, then again, as if the silence itself was enough to bind them. Clara's hand rested over her lap, fingers brushing the braid. Her heart no longer ached with emptiness. It throbbed with life, fragile but sure. She was no longer the woman who had closed her eyes to die. She had opened them to firelight, to danger, to the steadfast presence of a man who had chosen her side. And Elias, scarred and solemn, realized the walls he had built had not kept dignity alive. They had only kept love out. By letting her near, he had not lost himself. He had found what remained worth living for. The fire burned low. The rocking chair creaked in rhythm with the whetstone's rasp. 2 lives, once hollowed, now filled, by the quiet fullness of shared survival. The silence was no longer hollow. It was whole.